Hello. Welcome to the lecture on vertical and horizontal scope for the strategic management class that you're taking. To give you an idea of what we're going to talk about, first I'm going to go back to sort of the basics and briefly talk about what is strategy. Then get into the details of corporate scope, vertical and horizontal scope, but it's also called integration and diversification. And you'll see why as we go on in the lecture. But first, kind of a big question is, what is strategy? All right. Strategy is a set of goal-directed actions a firm takes to gain and sustain a competitive advantage. So I'm kind of putting the whole class together, right? Strategy are things you do to gain and sustain competitive advantage. But there are different components. What we have been doing so far is largely business strategy. And that's doing those things within a single business. Think of a business in this case as a single market, and we're really thinking about how to compete to create value for customers. Okay, we are now moving into what you would call corporate strategy, and which you're thinking about is where to compete, both in terms of product markets, value chain, and locations. Making sure that you understood about organizational structure and culture were really important, because the right kind of structure and culture can be crucial as a firm considers the scope of its organization. In this lecture, we are going to talk specifically about the first two bullets. But let me try to put this all in a little bit more context for you. We have seen a lot of things so far in this course, and I'm really proud of all of the work that you've put in. We went through a lot of stuff in a short period of time. But now you can kind of see all the things that sort of happen within a firm and its environment. Okay. So first we have the firm and all the things we have to think about it in terms of its internals, a firm's value chain, its generic business strategy, how the firm generates value, thinking about the stoplight, Rio and what are the firm's key competency and resources, and then how all of those both help to create but are also impacted by formal and informal organizational structure. Then, if we widen the aperture a bit, we can see how firms exist within the context of external analysis. And for that, we have Porter's 5 forces to sort of understand how attractive the industry is. And we have Pestle to understand the broader macro environment. Okay, now don't sit there and be a hater about my diagram. I realize it could be more dope, but it gets the point across. Okay, I can hear you laughing about it. But at any rate, what you can kind of think about as moving from the consideration of how to compete to where to compete, and think that there are sort of two overarching concepts to keep in mind as you make that transition. I'm going to introduce those to you. Okay, thing to understand here is horizontal integration. Okay, and that means one of two things. All right, get ready for some bad animation. We will do this one first because this kind of horizontal integration, horizontal scope, is the one that you're most familiar with. Okay? Horizontal integration means buying or expanding at the same point in the value chain which you currently are, or it's buying a firm outside your industry in a completely different industry. To put this in perspective, McDonald's buying Dunkin' Donuts, or even more wild, McDonald's buying Ducati, the motorcycle company, for some reason. Okay, that would be horizontal integration, or a question of horizontal scope. Horizontal in this case means approaching somewhat different markets and customers outside of your value chain. Okay. Speaking of value chain, that's vertical integration. And when you think of the word vertical, always think value chain. They both start with V. Some of you are probably saying, why is Prof D saying vertical when those arrows are clearly horizontal? And that's fair. So I can flip it around in a subsequent slide. Okay? But what I want you to think about is moving backwards and forwards along the value chain. Okay? If you are vertically integrating backwards, you're trying to control where the input is coming from. Okay? An example of this would be, let's say, the McDonald's. Right? McDonald's buys a bunch of farms. Okay? That's McDonald's doing backwards integration. They're controlling where their inputs, so where the meat, potatoes, bread, the grain for bread's coming from, that would be backwards integration. Okay? Forward integration is when you control where the output goes. Right? That would be the equivalent of Microsoft buying Best Buy. Okay? Microsoft makes Xboxes, they sell software, they make Surface computers, and those things are all sold in Best Buy. So if Microsoft were to acquire Best Buy, it's trying to control where the output is going. All right? That's vertical integration. Okay? And again, just to make it fair, I flipped it around, so now it looks like it's vertical. Okay, again, what you're trying to consider in terms of where you compete is that you can try to compete in different parts of a value chain. The thing to keep in mind is that for every output of a company's value chain, it can be an input into someone else's. All right. So, as a reminder, when you think vertical integration, think value chain. And to bring this all back together, here is sort of the OG diagram from day one. Okay? And now we can kind of see that business strategy, sort of value proposition, target market, the stoplight, the generic strategies, or how we compete, okay? But now we are getting into corporate strategy, which is where we compete. This kind of places it in the map that you saw initially, okay? Now, to get more specific, another way to talk about corporate strategy is to talk about the scope of the firm, the full scope of where the firm is going to operate. Now, to figure out what determines how far each company can or will go in terms of horizontal, vertical, or global scope, it has to consider three things. For horizontal integration, the key thing to think about is resource relatedness, which is just a question of how similar the resources are between various, to create various products, or between various companies that you might try to acquire or merge with, okay, and the different ways those resources can be deployed. For vertical integration, the key consideration is transaction costs, which are exactly what they sound like, the costs of doing a transaction. But I mean something very specific that I will get into. For global scope, the last thing to think about is distance. Yes, some of that is physical distance, but it's also cultural distance, and I'll get into that more in the next lecture. Now, when I said resource relatedness, that should have sent your spidey senses tingling and Rio should have popped into your head. Because the kind of resources the firm has determines what kind of horizontal integration it does. And that specifically means in terms of resources, not products. Let's say for a moment that you have a proprietary process for making a very durable and tough light alloy of titanium, and you were using it to make shielding for satellites. Right? That's something that people actually do. Titanium is used to make shielding for satellites. Okay. There are not an infinite number of uses for this particular intellectual property. But one other thing that light alloys of titanium could be used for are making replacement hips and bones. You could use that same thing in a medical capacity. All right? So in this case, the IP is a real resource that is fairly specialized that can only be used in sort of a narrow scope. Okay. Alternatively, the resource relatedness could be about something different. It could be something more general. Someone could be simply really amazing at running a business. She's great at running them and making them more efficient and making them more innovative, and she knows how to apply that anywhere. Okay? Well, that more general skill of a talented manager can be applied across a number of organizations, and that allows more distant horizontal integration outside of the initial industry. Now, the level of horizontal integration can exist in a range, and the revenue can kind of give you a clue as to what level of horizontal integration, or in this case, you also call it corporate diversification, that a firm is interested in. Okay. Single businesses, the money, the revenue comes primarily from one thing. For Coke, that's really just water or water with sugar in it. Okay. Facebook, that's ads on social media properties. Single businesses, more or less. Okay. Dominant businesses, there's a bit of diversification, but the business themselves have resource relatedness. Okay. Harley Davidson is mostly bikes, but some of it is the revenue is generated from its retail clothing store. It's retail clothing to ride bikes. Okay. These two businesses share the resource relatedness of excellent lifestyle marketing skill. There's a whole sort of lifestyle associated with being a Harley owner. Okay. Related constrained means that there's more of a revenue equality among all the businesses, and they may be slightly different, but all the businesses still have resource relations. Okay. Nike, for example. Nike makes shoes, but it also makes sports clothes, some dress clothes, some sports equipment. Okay. There's a related resource of sort of athletic clothing design. Okay. There's more diversification in the revenue sources, but all the businesses are related from a resource standpoint. Related linked means that some businesses have resource relatedness, but more of the focus is using particular competencies and knowledge of human capital across the business. GE historically has been a good example of this. Some of their businesses were very resource related. For example, they had an aviation division that makes jet engines, okay, and a utilities division that makes gas-powered turbines. Jet engines and gas-powered turbines that generate electricity are very structurally similar. So the intellectual property relates these two divisions. On the other hand, GE has also had a financial services arm which has virtually no resource relationships with other departments. Okay. Then finally, there's unrelated diversification, in which the businesses themselves have pretty much no resource relation. Berkshire Hathaway is kind of like this historically. Okay, if you ever know, that's Warren Buffett's company. They own all kinds of things from Dairy Queen to Geico, the insurance with the duck. They're kind of all over the place. But venture capital shops are also unrelated diversification. The people at the very tops of these organizations, both Berkshire Hathaway and venture capital firms, they have some skill in picking competent managers and good ideas. Okay? But there aren't inherently resource relations necessarily among the companies that they choose to invest in. Some of you are finance people and you have studied portfolio theory. So one of the things that you are probably thinking is the overall idea that diversification is beneficial. The idea from a portfolio standpoint of investments is that investments tend to co-vary, all right? And some of them don't exhibit tight correlation. And so as a result, if you have diverse investments, your portfolio will be less of a victim to downturns in the market. Okay. And here, diversification is also beneficial, but that's true only to a point. There are benefits to having some diversity in the business you are in, but only if there is some relatedness among them. On average, as businesses just slap together companies with no relations, returns tend to fall off. Okay, Berkshire Hathaway aside. Okay, here are some examples of horizontal integration. Facebook buying Instagram. They're in the same industry and in the same level of the value chain for that industry. Okay, but at the same time, some of the acquisitions, they actually have slightly different product markets as well as slightly different customers. Okay? Your dad might be on Facebook, but your 16-year-old cousin wouldn't be caught there ever. Okay? Then Anheuser-Busch and InBev is another example of a pretty closely related horizontal merger. Okay? Both beer companies, right? Gillette and Procter & Gamble are a little further afield, but they were generally in the business of making hygiene products. So in this integration, they could get some benefits from scope economies, and research and development costs from hygiene products could be distributed over a larger number of products. All right. Now let's move on to vertical integration. Okay. And the thing that determines vertical integration is transaction costs. And those are what they sound like. It is the cost associated with economic exchange. I know that sounds obvious, but this is actually kind of a big deal, and there are two things I want you to think of here. Okay. If someone says transaction costs, think of the phrases make or buy or asset specificity. Okay, here's why. All right, first of all, transaction costs earned two different people Nobel Prizes. Okay. Ronald Coase and Oliver Williamson. So they're no small thing, right? 2 Nobel Prizes just on this topic. Right? But here's what I mean when I say make or buy and asset specificity. Make or buy simply means you're asking the question, are you going to do something inside the firm or are you going to do it out in the open market? For things that are relatively simple, doing it out in the market is fine. For any more complex thing, the task of trying to write the perfect contract to get the precise thing you want may be hard to accomplish in the open market, so you do it in-house. Okay? So that's why you see these bullet points. Complete contracts are practically impossible to get. Okay? And transacting through a market, you may be susceptible to opportunistic behavior by other parties. Okay? So sometimes it makes more sense to do something within the context of the firm. And the way to think about it is that if it's more expensive to do the thing you're trying to do in the open market than it would be in the firm, then you should make it. Alternatively, if it's cheaper to do outside the firm than it is to do it inside the firm, then you should buy it. Okay. Then there's the concept of asset specificity. Can an asset be used across multiple situations and purposes? If there is no next best use case for something, then it will always be difficult to acquire. In which case, it's better to have it inside the firm, make it internally rather than buy it. Okay, and this can apply to physical assets, or it can apply to specially trained people. It might be really, really, really difficult to train people to do a certain thing, right? And so it's a highly specific asset. Okay, I've tried to describe 2 Nobel Prizes worth of scholarship in one slide. If you have follow-up questions on this, just let me know. All right. But there are important things to take away from this is on the next slide. Okay? Again, if it is more expensive to buy it in the open market than it would be for you to make it, that is when you should expand up the value chain. Okay? If it is cheaper to do it in the market than in-house, then you have a number of options in which you can engage depending on how vital or complex the things you need are to do it. Just so you know what all these relationships are, here's a handy dandy little arrow that specifies what the boundaries of the firm are, okay, and then there's this continuum from make or buy. Okay. Activities performed in-house are pretty straightforward. I think you all understand what making something in-house is. A parent-sub relationship is when a parent company creates a separate subsidiary to make the product or do the service that the parent company needs, and the subsidiary is owned by the parent, but it is legally a separate entity for liability purposes. Okay. Then there are joint ventures, in which two or more companies own equal shares in a third company that produces the product or service. Equity alliances is when, in addition to having a contract to do something, a company buys a non-controlling equity stake in the company they have a contract with to demonstrate they're committed to the relationship. The remaining items I feel you're probably more familiar with: long-term contracts, short-term contracts, and arm's length transactions are just sort of straight up buying something. Okay? When you go into a grocery store and you buy $10 cheese, that is an arm's length transaction. Okay? If you have any questions about this, just reach out to me and I'm happy to clean up any questions that you may have. Okay. You may be wondering, what are some vertical integration examples? Okay? And it turns out a great company to think about from a vertical integration standpoint is actually Apple. Okay? It has gone both directions on the value chain. It moved backwards on the value chain when it acquired Dialog Semiconductor, firm that makes key chips and circuitry that were inputs to the iPhone. Okay? And then it moved forward on the value chain when they created the Apple Store, because they were controlling where the input goes. I know all of you are used to shopping in the Apple Store, but time was that if you wanted to buy an Apple product, you had to go to like a Circuit City or a Best Buy to get it. Right? Now, Apple, strictly speaking, didn't do a vertical integration through acquisition. It built out the Apple Store on its own. But nonetheless, that is an example of vertical integration. So far, I've spent a lot of this lecture talking about how to determine what level of horizontal or vertical integration makes sense. But I have not yet talked about the reasons for doing so. For horizontal integration, the reason that you do it, it's all about diversification. Horizontal integration can give you access to new products, it can give you access to new customers, and as we talked about, it's a way of diversifying your risk exposure. Okay? The reasons that you would vertically integrate are actually more extensive. One is that you integrate to control risk. Maybe one of your key suppliers is not a stable producer, and they make a key input to your business. Okay. Maybe the reason that they're not stable is because they're not well managed. Right? Well, you could buy them, and that would be a way to stabilize that source of risk. Okay. Maybe you are in an industry with high supplier power. Well, one way you could mitigate that is to buy a supplier to lower the supplier power in that industry. Okay. You may have created a product that no one quite knows how to sell, or that anyone wants to sell. So maybe you have to open your own retail stores in order to make it possible. That would be a way of forward integrating. Okay. Maybe the market is declining. Maybe there's not a lot of other companies that need one of your inputs, right? So that would be a reason to acquire that company. And again, we mentioned asset specificity. You vertically integrate because there are certain assets for which they only have one use, right? And it makes it easier if you vertically integrate. Now, there are a bunch of different advantages and disadvantages that come with integration. There are a few that I want to mention here. For horizontal integration, a big one of these is economies of scope. A lot of costs for certain things are high and fixed, but if you have a lot of different businesses that can use those fixed resources, then you can spread those costs out over those businesses. Another one for horizontal integration is differentiation in the form of product. And specifically, that's bundling or cross-selling. My favorite punching bag, Comcast, is an example of this. They originally just did cable. Okay? But then they were able to horizontally expand into internet, phone, and original content, right? They bought NBC, right? So now they can bundle all these things together and sell them to you. Greedy a-holes, right? But there are two big problems with horizontal acquisitions. Think back to that divisional structure diagram from the the organizational structure lecture. Companies that have lots of different businesses like that are almost always set up in a divisional structure, and it can be very hard and expensive to coordinate across very different businesses. All right. Remember how I said a few slides back about how companies get less profitable the more diverse their businesses are? Coordination costs are why. Okay. Another challenge is antitrust. If you get too big in any one industry, right, there's a good chance the government's going to come knocking because they'll be concerned about consumer harm. The advantages for vertical integration are simple. Basically, you have better control over longer parts of the value chain, and your costs can come down as you pick up some learning effects. All right, and then you have the benefit of maybe having improved quality and definitely improved scheduling since you know where all the inputs are coming from. But there are a few disadvantages that might not be what you would expect. The first is that by vertically integrating, the quality of your product could counterintuitively go down. Having firms being forced to compete can actually make products better. Okay. If you have just one supplier for your inputs and that supplier is you, then the quality of that input could actually go down. The other problem is that you can get locked into a technology. Imagine if you were Sony in 2000 and you bought some company that makes cathode ray tubes that you use in television. All right. Well, then, mid-2000s come around, people are starting to use LCDs, and now you are stuck with that technology because no one's buying big cathode ray tube TVs anymore. Right. For those of you who don't understand what a cathode ray tube is, first of all, you've heard the expression CRT. That's what it stands for, cathode ray tube. They are these things that literally look like tubes, right, that used to be the things that helped generate pictures in monitors and in TVs before LCD monitors became sort of the de facto technology. So we've talked about how we determine optimal scope of the organization, but then we have to think about something kind of unique, and that is being organized to exploit at the corporate level. Okay, we've talked about the things that determine optimal scope. Okay, the first three letters of RIO, this resource relatedness, or transaction costs. But the O is really important. Okay, can you find the right structure that allows people to focus on the company's particular needs given the optimal scope? Is that a functional or divisional structure? Okay. That can help with both controlling and coordinating, right? Then, what's your company's culture? Remember, culture is very good at helping people know what to do in absence of explicit instructions. A good culture can help reduce coordination costs, especially as a company gets larger. And altogether, these are capabilities that help us to know whether a firm is able to create value at the corporate level. Okay? And this brings us to a topic that you may have heard before. Core competencies. These are firms' core strengths. This, of course, includes resources that are valuable, rare, and inimitable, but also the capability, to be organized in the right way with the right culture, which then allows you to create value for your customers. And remember that all the things that I've brought up in both horizontal and vertical integration impact the stoplight, as they can both bring down cost through things like economies of scope or lowered coordination costs in the value chain, or they can increase willingness to pay through cross-bundling or increased product quality. As for the mechanisms for how a company expands its scope, there are kind of 4 ways you can do it. The one that you're most familiar with is acquisitions. One company simply buys another and expands. Okay? Another way is simply a new venture. Coke wakes up one day and says, hey, wait a second. What if we didn't put sugar and coloring and we just sold the water? And someone else goes, holy crap, that's brilliant. Well, that's a new venture. That's Dasani. Okay? Alternatively, you could do a joint venture with another company, which is basically teaming up to do something, but without there being any acquisitions. You create a separate entity that you both put money into, okay? And you can share the costs and the risks, okay? And lastly, there's outsourcing, which you can actually do. You can actually use to reduce your scope with this one by having a non-core function that's done elsewhere, okay? Look closely at the advantages and disadvantages for these, okay? One that I want to point out, just because we've talked about Apple, is on new venture, a problem is it doesn't meet, it doesn't meet any customer needs. That's Next Computer. Next Computer was a beautiful new venture, as a beautiful product, but no one needed it, okay? And another thing that I'd want to point out is, like, look at the places where culture comes up, right? Culture can be a problem in a joint venture. Integration issues, culture can be a problem in acquisitions. So just make sure that you understand that there's different advantages and problems for these various scope methods. This would be a very good thing to test on, say, a test or a strategy worksheet, that kind of thing. Great multiple choice questions. Okay. But here's the key takeaway. If you have done all of these right, and the combinations create more value together than they would apart, this is what synergy is. And it's worth noting that this is really difficult. Many mergers and acquisitions are failures because there is not enough additional value being created through the combination of businesses. But knowing the different ways that vertical and horizontal integration can potentially create value and where it can go wrong can start to give you some sort of map for how to think about integration and diversification and ways to create value when you're a manager in the future. And ideally, corporate strategy should positively influence your business strategy. It's not a question of doing one or the other, right? Your corporate strategy should help your business strategy as you're trying to gain and sustain competitive advantage. Okay, the key takeaways from this is I want you to know the definition of corporate strategy and why it's different from business strategy. Know and understand horizontal and vertical integration, or diversification and integration. Okay, know why firms would integrate and what drives integration success. Okay, understand the different aspects of them, right? Types of diversification and how they're related to performance. The continuum, remember that arrow from make to buy, understand those things along that arrow and what are the advantages and disadvantages of integration decisions. Understand organizing decisions. I talked about coordination and control. There's some detail in the book that's worth knowing. Understand the definition of synergy, and then also how core competencies connect to scope. And that's it. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you at the next lecture.